Tim Allister.
Mr. Speaker, the primary focus of this debate to this point has been on the content of this EU law. I want to shift the focus to the much more important issue of the constitutional affront that this motion is. And the constitutional affront can be summarised in this way. What this motion amounts to is an acknowledgement and assent to the fact that in what patently is a devolved issue, namely how we prepare animal foods, that only the EU can now make those laws for us. That this Assembly can't legislate on this issue, that the Westminster Parliament cannot legislate for this part of the United Kingdom on this issue. Only a foreign jurisdiction, the EU, can formulate and pass laws touching upon this issue. And not just this issue. Of course, every issue that is recited to the tune of hundreds of laws in Annex 2 of the Protocol. So the real constitutional affront that some don't want to face up to, that some embrace, of course, because they want to see Northern Ireland subjugated under the EU. But those who claim they don't, the issue they're not facing up to is that here we have a situation that a pretty mundane law can only ever now be made by a foreign parliament. Cannot be made by the Parliament of the United Kingdom, cannot be made by the Northern Ireland Assembly, can only be made by a foreign parliament. And the motion's well named as an applicability motion, because by our slavish acceptance of it, we are giving assent to the applicability of that appalling and absurd situation that only a foreign parliament can legislate for this area of law in Northern Ireland. That is what this Assembly is being asked to assent to. And that, to me, is so constitutionally absurd and such a constitutional affront that, frankly, I cannot and I will not support it. And isn't it the ultimate absurdity to be told in this debate by the DUP, the party that told us, in the words of Sammy Wilson, there should be no EU law applying to this part of the United Kingdom, repeated by then leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, repeated by multiple members who sit in this House. EU law was a red line, we were told. It should not be applied to this part of the United Kingdom, we not being part of the EU. And yet today, the DUP has come to the point, or at least those of them that are here, and I think there are some noticeable absentees, has come to the point that they tell us that the only way to attain parity with Great Britain is to vote through this EU law. Think of it. The only way to get parity with Great Britain is to vote through an EU law, because this EU law just happens to bring the EU into line with Great Britain. Now, it may well be sensible for the EU to reduce its unattainable 100% organic requirement. It may well be sensible for it to come into line with the 95% that prevails elsewhere. But when it comes to Northern Ireland, it should be this Assembly, or at least Parliament, that's making that decision, not this foreign Parliament of the EU. And we're told there's no downside. Sorry, there is a huge constitutional downside. And those who roll over, as they have, and assent to that, are showing their disregard for that constitutional front and, of course, for their own previously unalterable position, we were told. And they say, oh, if you don't vote to this, there'll be divergence. No, there won't, because we know from the explanatory paper the British government's going to assent to this anyhow. But we're going to give them the cover. But what about tomorrow? What if GB decides in further deregulation that it will deregulate below 95%? That it will go down to 90%? And remember, the British government is presently conducting a review of all its organic legislation. There's no publication of that expected to the end of 2025, but it's subject to review. What then? What if GB goes to 90%? Well, hapless Northern Ireland, supposed integral part of the United Kingdom, remains trapped in this EU law, remains subject to this 95% delineation. So there is no assurance of parity here. The only assurance here is of subservience to a foreign parliament. And that, sadly, unsurprisingly for some, but surprisingly for others, is where the DUP and the Ulster Unionists in this House have got themselves to. And of course, what they're embracing is, for any such product that was ever produced in Northern Ireland, it wouldn't be labelled as produce of Northern Ireland. Article 4 of the regulation makes it very clear. It would be labelled with the EU logo and labelling, underscoring the fact that we are that subservient part under EU law. This is a situation where Northern Ireland, a part of the United Kingdom, is being subjected to colonial EU law. Law we didn't make, law we can't change, but which today we're invited to slavishly endorse. Endorse colonial rule from the EU. They made the law. It's their law. It's not ours. It's a law we can't change. And regardless of the merits or the demerits of the content, it does not deserve democratic assent from anyone who holds the fundamental democratic principles that when you live in a place you should be able to make your own laws, not be subjugated to the laws of a foreign power. And so I will not today give my consent, and I wasn't sent here to give consent to colonial EU rule, and I certainly will not be giving consent to it. DUP made that mistake on the 8th of December 2020, when they blindly, foolishly, in face of warning, embraced 45 different EU laws, including the one that says you can't bring British soil into British Ulster. And they bolted it onto the statute book. Sadly, today, we're going to have a repeat performance. And one will be interested to see if we get a vote as to who doesn't vote for this. As I pointed out, I noticed some notable absentees from the divided DUP benches. I just wish you had the courage to vote against and stand up against EU colonial law and the obscenity and the affront that it is imposing upon, I suppose, democratic assembly.